governance in the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Tata Institute of Social Sciences is a unique institution with a large number of schools. So this is, and centers. So this is the center attached to the School of Law, which alone I was aware of. Formerly, he was the chair of the Nodal Center for Excellence in Human Rights Education, established by the Government of India in the years 2016 to 2018. He's been somebody with a lot of experience trying to mix his academic capabilities with issues on the ground. I knew Dr. Parivelan during the tsunami period when he served in Tamil Nadu. And he served very well, and we became good friends then. And this is a post-tsunami relationship that has continued, which is surviving in the corona period as well. He associates himself with a variety of universities across the globe, with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in a number of meetings and retreats that he's invited there for. I looked at all the universities that he visits, including the New York University, and said, Dr. Parivelan will be happy that post-corona, he may not have to travel too much outside and might be able to do all those meetings online now. He comes from a very strong academic background. He did his MA, he did his MPhil, and he did his PhD in the very, very well-known Jawaharlal Nehru University. That is enough to speak about who he is. We are proud of your association with us, Dr. Parivelan. We welcome you warmly, and we do hope that these 170 odd participants would now join your larger cloud of fans that you have, as I always used to see it on the TIS campus. You will journey with them, I know. You will journey with their experiences in different parts of the country, and I'm sure they will be benefited by your interactions this afternoon. Over to you, Dr. Parivelan.
Thank you, Mr. Henry, for the kind words and introduction, and very good afternoon to all the participants. At the outset, I would like to compliment and thank for inviting me here, and compliment for organizing this human rights course. When I heard about it from Mr. Matthew a week before, I was very excited that it's a relevant time this program is being introduced, when people are slightly free to engage from home, one, and two, all the more than peace times and normal times, we can say that this COVID pandemic time, it is all the more relevant to revisit, refresh, learn a little more, and from the practical side of it, and then probably dialogue, discuss, and put certain things into action. Therefore, I compliment the entire People's Watch and the Institute for Human Rights Education team for running this course. And I kind of happened to attend or watch few sessions, quite exciting, quite informative, I should say. Particularly on the day of inaugural, I was listening to Mr. Milun. It was just got Milun Taria, and it was just quite interesting how he linked the UDHR and the role of India. Quite interesting. I did not meet him much earlier, as introduced by Mr. Henry. During the times of post-tsunami, I was just facing and seeing his quite an important role. He was at the time the special rapporteur on the shelter issues and internal displacement issues. How he prefaced a note on what kind of discriminations are happening vis-a-vis shelters in a post-tsunami context. It was quite interesting. It made a remarkable impact at the global level, I tell you. But I personally was affiliated with UNDP those days, and I could see how that one single report on discrimination post-tsunami rehabilitation and recovery process, triggered almost the UN deputy special envoy, including the special envoy, Mr. Bill Clinton at the time, and then the deputy envoy came down. Although almost all 5 or 6 countries, including India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Indonesia, and it triggered a new process. But little earlier, when these issues were highlighted, it wasn't taken. Therefore, I'm recalling Mr. Qattari's contribution at the time. It was very fascinating to listen to him, how he traced the history of EDHR and India's contribution, India's role, which will answer some of the things when we discuss about individualism versus collectivism, about the first world and the third world, how we bridge the understanding of human rights. We'll discuss it. Thanks to Mr. Henry once again and the entire team for giving this opportunity. I hope also that I would come and share certain practical things later, because as Mr. Henry introduced, mine is actually a combination of being in academia, and I also kind of initially started teaching at Pondicherry University, but kind of moved out of academia and then went to field, actually worked with refugees through UNHCR, later on in the post-tsunami through UNDP affiliation, and humanitarian issues very closely. Then came back to TIS, and I found that the theory and practice combination made me to attract. I'll come in the end of my presentation and share certain things, learnings from TIS as well, which quite attracted me here to be here and continue to work and all that. Right. Now we will go into the a session where a broad title was given in terms of classification of human rights and the rights holders and the duty bearers and human rights based approach. This is the broad theme given. So I'd like to divide my presentation into 2 parts. One, already you are into introduction of human rights, genesis of human rights, and you're all into already various definitions and other things which are there. So I'll just try to look at the classification part and bring a critique on how this classification or compartmentalization of human rights into first generation rights or second generation rights or third generation rights. Good for conceptual clarity, but may not be practically working. I'll try to come to that and touch upon the rights holders and duty bearers a bit. And then I'll try to bring the continuum, how that's very relevant. Probably there we can take a break and do some discussion, some questions. Then the second part will be going into the human rights-based approach with certain practical examples in my line of work with refugees or disaster management, or some TIS examples I wanted to bring in to just share and throw some light on what we can look at it. So this is going to be my broad outline of my presentation. Yeah, next slide, please. Going into the classification of human rights, these are the broad 3 things I'll touch upon. With the first and second sub-themes, we can have a break and have some discussion, clarifications, or any queries, and then go to the second part. Yeah, next slide, please. So going into the classification of human rights, broadly we know that the history of human rights from Hammurabi to Magna Carta to the very world wars in a contemporary time, how that gave us a framework, that is UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as an important transition or important time of providing the clarity. What is the difference between the preceding times in various cultures, civilizations, various societies? We would have had human rights and human rights violations parallelly, lessons learned, and then that cycle must have been on. What makes the difference from the history, the civilizational, cultural epochs, what we see human rights emergence or human rights violations, and in the modern contemporary times of UDHR as a modern turning point after the world wars? is that for the first time that we are able to make it universal, make it transgressing cultures, transgressing societies, transgressing languages, nation states, political systems, all that we could, transgress and bring a kind of an uniformity. That makes it very different that the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights becomes an important epoch, turning point in the history of how we use the prism of human rights for our governance, for our way we function, the way we want to uphold the rights, the way we want to protect the rights of individuals, the dignity of the individual, or even want to apply that in a developmental paradigm. So therefore, that's just something very important in the contemporary time. So the bedrock is UDHR, and the related are the two important covenants, the covenant on civil political rights as one, and the covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights is another, which becomes important. We all know combining these three makes into the Bill of Rights. Now, these three classifications also has some kind of a time chronology or a kind of ideological sort of a chronology. Thereby, it has been framed that the civil political rights would form as the first generation of rights. We'll first discuss what they are and then also try to come to critique how this division is a bit artificial or a bit anachronistic when we look at the relevance of the rights application in a global sense. So in the classification of human rights, the first being the civil and political rights as first generation of rights, we have to see emanating from the UDHR. And before even I go into delve that a little bit to glimpse at it, I would like to recall that the way Mr. Milun Kothari was telling about India's contribution in the human rights framework emergence. Even I believe that even there was a debate at the global level that how we work towards civil political rights taken up by United States and other developed nations on one side, and the economic, social, cultural rights as if they could be compartmentalized, and then it was seen as the second world led by the former Soviet Union and some of the socialist communist countries. And when this debate was coming up, which will be a priority, which will be taking its frontal role. And I believe that India and Lebanon, particularly these two countries, played a pivotal role in telling that we could have them as two separate conventions that see them how they operate and how we could operationalize. That's something very interesting again, the role India seemed to have played there amongst other countries, push for two separate conventions. And therefore, conventions emerged. These civil political rights, as we see, are also called as the traditional rights of individuals. And these are also seen as reflecting the doctrine of laissez-faire, meaning lesser interference or non-interference from the state and that sort of a thing claim. So therefore, it tries to aim at protection of citizens against arbitrary actions of the state. They include right to life, right to liberty, security, right to privacy, right to free trial, right to equality, right to dignity, and so on and so forth. It also includes, as we know, the freedom from torture, inhuman treatment, freedom from slavery, forced labor, freedom of religion, freedom of thoughts, opinion, expression, freedom of association, freedom of movement, so on and so forth. So this is how, this generation. So the politics of civil and political rights is that as if the first world nations, if I may go by that classification, which is again redundant now in a globalized world, or you can say in the recent shift when the Soviet Union and the systems collapsed, the second order. So even whether the third world countries are there to bring this classification. Anyway, so the developed nations or the global north, by and large, took it up that the civil political rights will be seen as a priority, seen as a first generation. Yeah, next please. We go to the next as the economic, the next slide please. Economic, social and cultural rights which otherwise labeled as the second generation of rights. And when we have the civil and political rights seen as the negative rights because it's about restraining the state from having any arbitrary or negative interference, here it is seen this in the context of social, economic, cultural rights. We need to see more of a positive action, proactiveness from the state to provide, to facilitate the conditions essential for the promotion of the rights of people, the protection. Here, as we know, these rights includes, which is not limited, but right to work, right to fair remuneration, right to collective bargaining, right to property, right to housing, education, health rights, rights to social security, participation in cultural affairs, and so on and so forth, seen as the second generation of rights. Now, next slide, please. Now, when you go to the third level, either you call it third generation of rights, or otherwise it's termed as the developmental rights or the solidarity rights, seen from the third world point of view, that the newly emerging nations laid emphasis on the solidarity, that the nations becomes free from the colonial clutches, and they are able to exercise their self-determination. They are able to choose their path of growth, development, their models, and therefore this has got another connotation that it's seen as as a solidarity or a thing, and otherwise also it actually relates to very many other contemporary issues which are of the recent times relevant, whether it is the right to development, the child rights, the women rights, environmental, climate, many things we could actually relate here. So for the classification sake, when we look at it, the third generation rights or a category of recent origin. The emergence of this category is closely associated with third world nationalism and also the realization of the developing states that they also want to participate in the international affairs, international order, and but the international framework structure is quite loaded against them, meaning that the structures are more towards some of the developed nations or the global north, which would dominate. So therefore, the solidarity rights becomes all the more important, that the South-South cooperation or the developing nations coming through for us like G77, all these are more relevant. So these rights are seen as collective in nature, and it is also seen that it is very important or pivotal to have the international cooperation for their achievement. So their achievements also depends as a collective effort of people to people, the government to people, which includes, by and large, their right to peaceful existence, their right to development, their right to good environment, right to be prevented from any ill effects of climate and other things. So we can take the examples of the 1992 from the international milieu's point of view, the Rio de Janeiro, Earth's otherwise called the Earth Summit on Environment and Development. We can take the example of the 1994 Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights, and many other examples could be taken. How the solidarity rights or third generation of rights. So this, as I said in the beginning, the experiences of the two world wars, which generated into thinking of developing, universal framework for human rights, which leads to these, trajectories. How in the last 6 or 7 decades, these are formulated and these are emerging. Variety of new rights are emerging. Therefore, we are classifying. Now, next slide, please. With a small, cursory look at some of these, I'm just trying to go into how, nevertheless, these things also form a sort of a critique that these compartments are, quite not compatible with, for example, 3 important elements which would be there. They are seen as the human rights framework has the element of universality, it has got the indivisibility, and it has got interdependence and interlinkage of each element. By this compartment, are we going into a very compartmentalized approach. So this itself is a critique that these are inconsistent and incoherent. So the critique itself is that when we lay out in a chronological way into three layers of generations of rights. Therefore, the principle of universality. Next slide, please. Principles of universality of human rights is founded on the notions of human rights to apply uniformly with equal force, equal levels. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So therefore, the principle of interdependence of human rights is very important. How do we do meaningful engagement of a particular right is dependent on possession of all other rights. The interlinkages of rights are very important. And the indivisibility, again, we can't be dividing. These are well accepted at the global level, that you cannot divide a particular kind of a human right. So therefore, these becomes important basic characteristics which needs to be upheld at any given context. Therefore, the interlinkages makes us clear that we need to look at it. Now, let's take a couple of examples. Next slide, please. Now, the chronological ordering is problematic. The prioritization is again problematic. It can be argued that some rights fall in more than one category. Mr. Henry, I was listening to him yesterday. He was taking up this example of right to self-determination. We know that the right to self-determination forms an important core of both civil political rights as well as economic, social, cultural rights. And these essentially, can be seen either as a first generation right, whereas some could argue that these are very relevant to the solidarity or the third generation rights as well. As we all know that the developing nations were trying to look at, how these are relevant. So therefore that, in fact, it could be seen as even second generation rights, that unless you bring in right to self-determination, you can't exercise the economic, social, cultural rights. So therefore, you see the interlinkages with one a particular notion that how all the three generation rights have to be applied equally and become relevant. Let's take another example. When you say right to development, which in the last 2 decades have become a very important element. We all know that how there has been shift when you say right to development, that you are trying to look at the development indicators, the human development index in particular. You don't look at essentially from the from the country's GDP alone or the other economic growth indicators, but therefore the right to development becomes very important. If you look here, it is generally agreed that the rights fall under the third generation, but it could be argued that the concept of development is also associated with social and economic realms. So therefore, the right to development could be classified as well in the second generation of rights. So this makes us clear that you cannot compartment. Therefore, I'm just trying to critique after placing these three generation of rights and what are the trajectories and what are the kind of rights which are emerging. Next slide, please. Next. Hello, am I audible now?
You are audible.
Okay, I'm audible, right? Yeah. So linking up next. Yeah. So, with these three generation of rights also could be discussed. I mean, the categorization also fuels another kind of a debate about individualism versus collectivism. As you know, individualism is a concept that deals with the individual rights or individual perspective versus collectiveness as a group or communitarian rights. So this is also seen. So it is often seen that the first generation rights, that is civil and political rights, are more emphasizing the individual rights, which can be easily argued that it can be enforced through the domestic courts of law. Whereas it is seen that the second generation or third generation of rights on the other are seen, which is seen as the collective rights of the notions of international solidarity and collectivism, that these are developmental ones, and these are may not be easily administered in the courts, cannot be justiciable in the domestic court. This is how it is argued about individualism versus collectivism. Next, please. But within this realm, we could also look at there are other major ideological tensions which are there underneath with this emergence of these human rights doctrines. The United Nations asserted that the human rights are universal, inalienable, interdependent, and indivisible. But however, the tensions are visible in terms of positive versus negative rights, in terms of rights versus duties and responsibilities, in terms of individual rights versus group rights, and the problem of universality versus Western perspectives or Western imperialism. So this is how you have the major thing running through how you look at the dichotomies, the inbuilt divisions on the basis of the ideological positions on how we classify these rights and how do we prioritize. So we know that just after the World War II, when the UN emerged, and the UN Charter, 1945, then 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the assumption is that we have had learnt from the experiences of the brutalities and savage full acts during the world wars, and probably a high time that now we are going to see a new world order with new nation states which had emerged at the global arena, many developing nations which were at the clutches of the colonial past. We were thinking that now being liberated and in the process of decolonization, that when these nations emerged, that we are going to have a kind of a world order which is going to be of peace and just, as the way the UN had foreseen or visualized. But very unfortunately, we know by late 40s, early 50s that it also went into a kind of a division, what we call in the realm of international relations, that world went into a kind of a Cold War, where you have the United States leading the Western democracies on one side, and then you have the former Soviet Union leading the socialist and communist countries. So this ideological division itself put an enormous pressure on the newly formed or newly emerged nation states, including India, where, for example, India took a conscious step of being a non-aligned country. At the time, very relevant that we don't want to be part of the power politics. And therefore, when the human rights doctrines also were emphasized, civil or political or social, economic, cultural rights, when the debates were there, we were trying to see the relevance of both and how we could converge and then, see the application or relevance of it. So therefore, we wouldn't want to, go into this kind of artificial dichotomy. But nevertheless, for the analysis sake, we are bringing in how sometimes the ideological positions created a lot of tensions on which comes first and how it gets emphasized. Now, extending from the very, next slide, please. Extending from the very, International Bill of Rights constituting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the civil political rights, the economic, social, and cultural rights, we could also see how other important things were emerging. For example, punishment for the crime of genocide. In 48-51, it emerges as an important tools to address that we can't, allow genocide to happen in any country where there's a cultural way of annihilating the minorities or other groups within a nation state. Sort of a thing. But till today, I do not know whether we are able to, address it, enforce it. The practical sides of it will come a little later. But genocide, we know the example of the recent, in our own neighborhood in South Asia, how there was alleged Tamil genocide in Sri Lanka, triggered a civil war for a very, very long time. From 83 to almost 2006, it went on a long, protracted conflict as an example, or the recent allegations of genocide in Myanmar, displacing the Rohingyas. We know how that is there, and very several other parts of the world. We have seen that, but we do have the Prevention of Genocide Convention. Similarly, there are International Covenant on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, 65-69. The Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, 79 onwards. And the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, Degrading Treatments of Punishment, 84-87. Then the Convention on Rights of Child, 89-90 onwards. Then the Rome Statute of International Criminal Court, 98-2002. These are all, several other human rights, which with thematic priority, they were also emerging in the international arena. And you know that these are all put into a process of, treaties or conventions, which get deliberated, and the countries are given a choice to sign and ratify. In this process, they would emerge and they would come and do that. So you have hundreds of them emerging as per the relevance, and then the international community, or the Committee of Nations, would go and participate in the deliberations, and then look at what are relevant. There are examples. We could say that there are conventions. For example, India has not taken up. We know that, for example, with regard to the refugees, there is a international convention on the status of refugees, 1951, and the related protocol, 1967 protocol. India has been hosting refugees, but for example, has not formally signed this convention. Similarly, the NPT, Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, or the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the example of the Statelessness Convention for 1954, or ending the statelessness in 1961, which are all emerging issues we know in the post NRC, in the post CAA, that these are very relevant, but India has not signed. So there are conventions which are optional. There are conventions where you sign, and that depends again what kind of political structure, what kind of political participation, what kind of pressure groups we have, and how we do. But there are, I would like to emphasize again, certain elements of signing and not signing. In between, you also have something called the customary international law, which lays the emphasis, otherwise called as the jus cogens, which emphasizes that even if you have not opted for one, but you have to abide by, protecting that, because it has been considered as something universal, something tested, something which is something non-negotiable. For example, within refugee rights, just to take an example, India may choose to say that I will not sign the Refugee Convention, not the related protocol. Now, for example, within the Refugee Convention, you have, for example, Article 33, which deals with the non-refoulement principle, that anybody who had entered your country as an asylum seeker or refugee shall never ever be thrown out forcefully. This is called the customary international law, which lays the emphasis on that it is something binding, even if a country has not signed the convention, that you and you follow it. I think that example is seen as a friction, that when the Rohingyas had entered India, India did not bother. But after some time, a year back or so, it suddenly came up with the notification that it is going to identify and deport all the Rohingyas. So I think the international community, including the UNHCR, had put a pressure on India that it cannot, or the UN Human Rights Council as well, that you cannot forcefully evict or forcefully send away the refugees where their life will be at risk again. On the simple notion of this, that it got reminded that you cannot do it. And thankfully, the court also, I think, as an interim judgment led by Justice Mishra, the former Chief Justice, I think he had said that we need to balance between national security and human rights and humanitarian aspects. We can't just like that, push a refugee or an asylum seeker who's already in your country. So this is an example of how you try to bridge basically that whether you've signed or not, how certain components of international law also becomes relevant. So this forms a backdrop of how we can actually go on classifying on what you have signed, what you have not signed, which are the positive rights, which are negative rights, which are first generation rights, which are second generation rights, or which are the developmental of the generation rights. And yet you would like to critique and see that we don't want to see them as compartments, but want to see them in a holistic manner, relevant at all times, because you have an ongoing process. A thing like human rights, which is very dynamic, can never be very static. At some point of time something is relevant, another point of time it is not so relevant. So therefore, this is a very brief cursory look at the classification of rights, how they are important in terms of upholding the right to life, dignity, right to equality, and other things. Now, moving very quickly into the next component, the rights holders and duty bearers. We know that human rights as a paradigm, human rights as a notion, human rights as principles, human rights as a framework, human rights as an operational instrument, how it plays a very vital role. Here we need to classify that how human rights are operationalized with two broad categories. One is somebody called the rights holders. The human rights holders, that's somebody who is entitled to rights, and the other one has the term duty bearers. Many of us may be very familiar with this thing. I'm just trying to give the simple definition of it. Now here, when you look at the right holders, that every individual without exception is seen as a rights holder. By virtue of being a human being, you are entitled to human rights, so therefore everybody's a rights holder, every individual, and they're entitled to same rights and must have the capacity to exercise rights and formulate claims and seek redressal. So this is how you see the rights holders. The duty bearers, as a definition, are primarily seen as the state actors and institutions. Here the state actors meaning the nation state, the countries or the governments, the actors and the institutions, as well as the non-state actors. Today, we are counting on the civil society organizations, the media, the corporates, industries, several other organizations would also come under the realm of non-state actors. So the duty bearers are identified in relation to specific right holders. If it is child rights specific context, who are the duty bearers? If it is women rights, who are the duty bearers? It is about the Adivasi rights or the Dalit rights. So you can just go into several spectrum. Into what are the kind of a context to look at the right holders, and who are the duty bearers. And they carry the obligation. The duty bearers carry the obligation in response to the right holders. That's how we see it. So just a pictographic thing drawn from the Google, just for the clarity. Next slide, please. One sees how the right holders, and the next slide, please. The right holders and duty bearers, one sees it as a cyclical link. So I would call that this is actually an important continuum. The right holders and the duty bearers are an important continuum, even though we divide the role, responsibilities, and accountabilities, but we see them as continuum because this is a very close interrelationship. If you go to the next slide please. Here you see that right holders as individuals who want to participate to claim certain rights from the bottom up, if you look at it. So they see a participation and look at the duty bearers, those institutions, whether it is state or non-state actors, that what role they could play to protect the rights. And from there, if you come down, it is very important to see in the cycle that how accountability is very important when the flow is from the duty bearers to right holders. So this can be seen in a number of contexts. That, for example, that if you look at either COVID or any other disaster as even a context, that there is an ex-NGO which comes to say that I'm here to protect your rights, or I'm here to do the relief, rehabilitation for you, for example. Now the NGO concern or the government agency, which is overall monitoring or facilitating, become the duty bearers, and the people who are affected by a particular disaster or natural hazard becomes the right holders. So they are expected to be part of the conception of the projects. They are supposed to be part of the decision-making process. They are supposed to be part of monitoring the implementation. what quantum of fund is being received by that organization, how that fund is being utilized, and how that is able to reach and deliver on the ground, what kind of quality. This is what we mean by accountability. The accountability is in terms of being transparent on what you have sought, what you have got, what you are implementing on the ground. Therefore, this cycle of right holders to duty bearers is something very important in all contexts, whether it is the criminal justice system or administration, whether it is the prisoners' rights, whether it is about any rights in any context, we can actually link it up and bring this relevance. Now, this is in an ideal sense. I've just brought out certain things very theoretically about the classification of rights, because already you're acquainted with the definitions and basic components. I just try to classify and bring here. I want to bring the next slide to go and bring an important interface that we tend to take, that the rights are available, rights are there for everyone, and it is just to be monitored and seen and facilitated. But the reality, as we know, when you have deep-rooted cultures, traditions, sometimes religion, many other things also comes into, including, for example, I have placed here 5 important categories. That your geography matters in terms of how you are included or excluded. Geography meaning here that whether you're living in a safe place or you're living in a vulnerable geographical space matters. What kind of rights you could exercise or not. You live in a coastal area, you are very vulnerable. You live in areas which are very close to low-lying area, you will be prone, or you're living in a earthquake-prone zone, you are living in that kind of a thing. Then in a general sense, you have discriminations which are there as an important element which goes on in the social realm, vis-a-vis gender or class or caste. You know how it's very important. Discrimination is one of the elements. Then you also see that how there are shocks and fragility, where you bring in here the notion of marginality and vulnerability. That there are vulnerable groups in an economic sense or social sense, or very fragile in a normal sense. And then what kind of governance operates at your country level, meaning the central or union government level, or your state level, or district level, or your panchayats and villages. So all levels of governance, how it works matters. Then the socio-economic status and conditions matter in terms of how. So these 5 elements could converge and then could say whether you are brought into the fold of social inclusion to uphold your human rights, or you're socially excluded where your rights are violated. Even though we all know that there is a principle which is emerging now, that leave no one behind. I'm sure many of you have read the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, and Sustainable Development Goals, where SDG particularly laid the emphasis that leave no one behind as a pertinent theme. If you look at from that lens, that how these are very, very important, that one has to take care when these elements converge. What kind of governance, what kind of geography, what kind of social structure fabric you are in, and what kind of fragility or comfort zone you live in, what kind of socioeconomic conditions, and how your rule of law works, how effective they are. That matters as an element. We may add that as a 6th element here. So these are very important to say that how your rights are protected, preserved, or they are put into jeopardy. We all know that our own experiences, which was shared in the previous presentations on our own constitution as a meta law, and how the constitution has ingrained many of these vital components which are there available in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into our own Part 3 of the Constitution, the fundamental rights, and Part 4, the directive principles of state policy. By and large, these classifications are also fit into Part 3 and Part 4 respectively, the civil political rights and the social economic and the cultural rights in a way are ingrained in our constitution. So these are there as a document, but how they are enforced, how they are practiced, and we all know the the practical gaps, the lacunae, which are very important to see. Then how does institutions come to play? How do you ensure that these are addressed, these are facilitated? What role the civil society, what role the human rights defenders play a very vital role is something very important to see here. And I would like to bring those aspects of practicality where we can use the human rights based approach. I would like to bring it probably in the next segment. Probably I think I would like to take a break here. Over to you, Mr. Matthew, for any questions or comments which we could discuss.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Very informative. There are a few questions, and all are different questions. So it's not possible to
share.
Yeah. So I will just read out the questions for you. One question says from Uttar Pradesh. One participant from Uttar Pradesh says there are certain rights. For instance, Article 15, right to nationality as a part of UDHR, but could not find it mentioned in the ICCPR. So rather than criticizing UDHR for being not binding, can we interpret it as the highest threshold of human rights standards the states are supposed to achieve? The other question says from Shrutika, our colleague, do you think it is practical to import the principles of universality, indivisibility, and interdependence of human rights? Can there be universal and indivisible human rights? The other question is with regard to why do we see human rights as purely an African Asian problem? Are we assuming that the West has no human rights issues? Then another participant from Maharashtra asked, is female genital mutilation under which international convention?
Can you repeat this again, please?
The female genital mutilation is mentioned under which international convention or conventions? Can I go to the next?
Yes, please.
If prioritization was problematic in the history, how should it have been? And for now, in Indian context, what should be our priority? The last three questions. How is it possible to keep the universality of human rights intact in a world where there is plurality of cultures? There are Islamic human rights, there are European human rights. How the universality is possible?
Okay.
Second last, global laws against genocide are inherently possible. How can the guilty be punished? The fact that those responsible for the Sri Lankan genocide are still in power today shows the plight of global human rights. And the last is with regard to the current ongoing crisis, but nicely linked to what you presented. The participant asked with regard to the Aadhaar and Arogya Setu app being made mandatory during this epidemic for any kind of state assistance. Similarly, all laws for the protection of workers have been suspended. So what will be the future of first generation and second generation rights of citizens of India? And how the international agencies like the UNHCR, who is on invitation in India, can mitigate these challenges? So you can select or you can club together in your responses, Professor.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much for collating and sharing the questions, and I'm happy that quite diverse and very interesting questions are being shared. I'll try to club some of them. I will not go very chronologically all the questions which came up, but I'll try my best to touch upon them. To start with, right to nationality. I think it's an important debate which was there, during the decolonization process of late 40s, early 50s. And we need to note one thing when we're talking about the right to nationality. If you look at the core of it, the nation state as a process emerges in the modern period from the context of Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, for example, which formulates on the basis of one nation, one religion, one culture. That's how you have The French language speaking, Roman Catholic, you have a French kind of a national identity. You are a German speaking with a Roman Catholic, with a German kind of an identity. You are a Anglo-Saxon, British. You have that kind of a British identity. Therefore, this kind of thing actually came up. When you look at many of the Asian and African countries, we are essentially multi-ethnic, multicultural, plural societies. So the more appropriate approach can be to call them as poly-nation nation state or multi-ethnic nation state to accommodate the nationalities. Now we have taken it for granted that we all come as one nation, and then thereby but nevertheless our constitution celebrates or appreciates or preserves or protects the diversity of religious diversity, cultural diversity, linguistic diversity. All are well protected, and therefore the project of making it as one nation, one religion, one culture doesn't suit many of the Asian and African countries, and Latin American countries for that matter. Essentially, that a country like India, like ours, or South Asian countries, or Southeast Asia, have plural multi-ethnic societies. So the right of nationality in that sense is in a way built in to preserve to some level of multiculturalism and diversity, which somebody else also asked in the question about universality of versus the pluralism. We'll come to the rights later, but this is how I look at it. So universalism, individualism, indivisibility, I think definitely these are all important. That today, if I club another question which came up later, that when the UDHR was also debated, some of their consultations and deliberations when we looked at it, the most important thing at that time also which was thrown is that whether it has the Christian Western notions are getting dominated in the UDHR, thereby whether it is discrediting the plural multicultural aspects which are emerging from Asia or Africa or Latin America, was actually shown or this was discussed. But the fact is that, if you look at the essential elements which are there in the UDHR, they are universal. They don't have anything to go and, particularly touch and say that, by promoting this, UDHR principle, that any of your culture or anything is going to be jeopardized. So we know that, there are pluralism, there are multiculturalism, which is appreciated, but definitely how we take on board the importance of the universality which has reached that level. Why more of an Asia or third world country focus? Because we see that as our context, as our relevance we are taking, but definitely this can be relevant very much to Africa. Africa is far ahead in terms of formulating their own regional human rights framework or regional refugee rights framework and other things. Where I think in Asia we are quite fragmented. For example, what happens in Southeast Asia, we are not connected much. Or what happens in the West Asia, we are not connected much. What happens in Central Asia, we are not connected much. I think we are slightly fragmented, and then yet we have a lot of common issues that we have to go along with. Therefore, we are focusing on Asia or South Asia in particular, looking from a developing country perspective. I can consciously avoid the world country perspective, at least developing the underdeveloped countries perspective. We need to look into that. Coming into the question a little bit on the genital mutilation and the prevention, I think there's a separate framework which came up, and this was very much debated underneath gender rights and health rights, that how this is a very important thing. And I think now worldwide there is a campaign, some of the African countries, some of even within India, some pockets when they are practicing how this could be addressed. But there were also some counter reactions, but I think it's today accepted that we have to eradicate it, address it at the core, and this is not an acceptable thing. How do we prioritize? And we also said in our discussion of critique that even though these things are there of chronology, but we see simultaneously many are relevant. It's not a chronology of first generation rights or second generation rights or generation rights matters, but these are simultaneously very relevant. Coming to very quickly on the genocide, even though in the 50s it was debated, discussed, and we did bring in that we need to address the issue. I think a participant friend has rightly raised the issue that many places this genocide violations are reported, including Sri Lanka. The participant has rightly pointed out that in spite of the fact that it has been proven that 2006, the last phase of the war, number of civilians were killed, there were mass killing, all these were reported. Even the rough estimate of United Nations alone said 40,000 innocent people were killed. And the other sources went about telling it's almost more than 1 lakh. Now, where is the accountability? How do you bring in? This, ironically, genocide happens in spite of the fact that just around the time, in 2005, if I'm not wrong, in the World Summit, we have brought in a notion called responsibility to protect, R2P it is called. The responsibility to protect is an interesting international framework to provide early warning, to address these kind of instances where there is mass killing or human rights violations or genocide or other kinds of war crimes which happens. These are supposed to be recorded, alerted. The international community is supposed to respond. There are 3 pillars very quickly to share within the responsibility to protect the framework. One, to identify and alert that the country something is going wrong, number 1 pillar. Number 2, if the country is continuing to be silent on what is happening within their territory, nation state, about genocide or any kind of arbitrary killings, then there has to be a reminder and capacity building, meaning that they should be told that if you don't have a capacity, the international community has an obligation to come and build your responsibility. And the third element talks, even if in spite of the reminders, capacity building, something goes wrong, how the international community can even think about economic embargoes or even kind of military intervention. That's how the 3 levels of the 3 pillars of responsibility. In spite of this, which came up in 2005, in 2006, right away you have it. The responsibility to protect itself emerged as an obligation on the international community from the lessons of Rwanda and other human rights violations and mass killings. Now, 2006 Sri Lankan incident happened right there, and the international community did not come and respond in terms of prevention. Or even the later, whatever has happened in the 10-11-12, few resolutions were noted in the UN Human Rights Council, like the United States resolutions were passed against Sri Lanka, saying that you yourself have committed certain crimes. You yourself have something called Lessons Learned and Reconciliation, a report they have had. The UN simply asked actually that your own report on lessons learned and reconciliation, what did you implement? What is your accountability? What is your way of implement? All these actually questions were raised, I think, but after 3 consecutive times it got silenced. I mean, you can say sidelined, even though the hybrid court and other thing has been formed. We do not know how effective it is in terms of going and telling a current government which is linked to the very incident and how they go scot-free. So in a nutshell, if you look at it, what happened in Sri Lanka is quite arbitrary, unfair, where in spite of a war and lessons learned, they did not go into any kind of reconciliation. They did not go into any kind of serious lessons learned and reflections. I happened to go on a short visit around 2013-14 for conducting a study on the refugees and their scope of rehabilitation. I was told that everything has within a few years moved into a developmental phase, meaning that already they have done reconciliation, they have done truth and finding, and then they have gone into the developmental phase of it. That sounded very, huge joke that they could, bypass all this. So I think genocide as an incident is a very serious issue. Not many are able to do. Coming to last question very quickly on, these new tools which are there by the state in terms of you have already a judgment on right to privacy and other things vis-a-vis Aadhaar. We all know that today we are also having new tools which come up in the COVID context. Somebody has rightly pointed out about Aarogya Setu and other things where the state could, monitor you. The state could, in the interest of COVID, it is justified that they are using it. But I think definitely, many of us are not comfortable that they could actually violate the right to privacy. I think these are the issues which are there, which we need to consciously see and how this could be challenged. I think it took quite some time when Aadhaar, the state was trying to come and impose in a huge manner. Some time, and then the court came up with a very, very progressive judgment that the right to privacy can never be jeopardized or compromised. I think these are very important in a way to uphold the rights. Right. Fine. Shall I, with a glimpse of these things, maybe certain things more are there, we can keep up in the last round. Shall I go to the next segment, please?
Yes, sure. Rajvel?
Yeah, Mr. Rajvel, can you just open the slide? Yeah, the next segment I just wanted to go is a little on the practical side. You know, what do we mean by human rights, based approach? Human rights as a framework. How do you, use it in terms of practical side? I will take quite a bit of practical examples here. I think I have about 15 minutes or so, and then some time for discussion. I'll try to go through a little fast. So the human rights-based approach is a conceptual framework for the process of human development that is normatively based on the human rights standards and operationality, and how they could be directed to promote and protect human rights. It seeks to analyze the inequalities that lie at the heart of developmental problems and redress. Can be the slide on? The slide on, please. Yeah.
Yes, it is on.
Yeah, thank you. It seeks to analyze the inequalities and address the discriminatory practices or even unjust distribution of powers that impede the very development. So we are looking at this from this lens. So here I would like to take up how the human rights-based approach can focus on promoting the access to justice for those who are marginalized, excluded, discriminated. Here I use the term access to justice not just from the legal aid point of view or just from the legal point alone, but I'd like to bring here the social, economic, and the legal as well. So this, I'm trying to broad base it in terms of developmental access, developmental rights, I'd like to bring in. So this approach also requires the rigorous analysis of gender norms, different forms of discriminations, the power imbalances which are there, and then to ensure that those interventions protect the rights of marginalized sections of people. Very quickly, next slide please, to look at the elements of good practices underneath the human rights-based approach. I just would like to spell a few things in a very cursory way. The human rights-based approach to development, where the programs have to identify a realization of human rights as ultimate goal of development. Human rights have to be seen as ultimate goal of development. People are the participants are recognized as the key actors in their own development rather than passive recipients. And participation is seen here as both means as well as goal. It is participation as a means and participation as a goal. Here the strategies have to be seen which are empowering, not disempowering. We have to also look at the outcomes and processes which are monitored and evaluated. As I was mentioning earlier, the right of people in development where they could actually be there in the inception or very conception phase, then they could be there in the planning stage, they could be there in the implementation stage, and if people could be there in monitoring and evaluation, there's nothing like that. Now what happens here is most of our developmental projects are there where people are just informed about it when everything is there. I just have an example that I happened to be there as a part of an independent study. We were carrying it out to understand the mega ports which were coming in. To our surprise, that one of the mega ports called the one of the major ports were announced as a part of the Sagar Mala scheme was in the tip of the country in Kanyakumari district of Tamil Nadu, where the people that said that they have a high density of population and then the fisher folks dependence on livelihood and other things are there, where the port could come and affect them largely. It is this tussle between the government announcing it midway without any initial conception or planning that they said that they want to implement a 40,000 crore mega transshipment port. The people were resisting it, that they are not willing to accept it, that this Tata Institute of Social Sciences, we were invited to conduct an independent social impact assessment. And we could go and engage with the port authorities, the government, what are the plans, and then why people are resisting, what are their impacts, what are their actual social thing. I mean, all these were juxtaposed, and then we could, prepare a report and submit to both government and civil society. We could get a picture that, fortunately, at least with the report submission, to our surprise, the government said that that particular location called Inayam in Kanyakumari, that they are moving out of it. Where they went further, how, we do not know. Within that scope, we could actually assess that what is the social impact. Then we come to know that the people are not at all aware of the conception of such projects and what are the kind of dimensions, what are the kind of implications, what are the scope. And this is how we see number of hundreds and thousands of such projects which try to displace people, whether it is mining or other things we all know, into the forest and other things where people are affected and displaced. So the programs have to focus on marginalized and excluded groups. The projects have to be locally owned. I think the ownership is something very important, that the developmental processes, projects and other things, that they are seen as only at the receiving end. They don't have a sense of participation. Therefore, they never get a sense of ownership. I witnessed this myself in a number of examples. Even during disasters, we could see that many agencies would come, formulate that we are going to build you houses, we are going to do this, replacement, or your fishing gear replacement, or something of that sort. But people are never consulted. So we could sense that many times where it is never locally owned, sometimes people's participation is very important. Then they're also supposed to the human rights based approach are supposed to reduce disparities, empower people who are left behind, and it is supposed to do a situation analysis where it is supposed to do course corrections, or look at the root cause of the problems, anything there to address it, they need to do. Next slide. The analysis also includes the stakeholders, including the capacities of state as a main duty bearer and the role of non-state actors, civil societies and others, as well as the rights holders to be very much there. These are certain things which one can see. Now let me just go in terms of looking at what are the mechanisms of protecting the human rights. Here I just wanted to just flag very quickly that there are a number of human rights treaty body mechanisms which help to advance the human rights. As we had seen earlier, conventions against torture, genocide, and other kinds of human rights, elimination of discrimination in women, Child Rights Convention, and so on and so forth. We can look at it. One of the most important tools is also the Universal Periodic Review, UPR as it is called. It's a very important, powerful mechanism where it's a state-driven process where the state does it, or also it is also called the non-state-driven process where the civil society participates, where every 4.5 years you go to the international fora, and then the government submits its own report, the civil society submits its parallel report, and then these are deliberated, that what are the gaps, what are the issues, what are the violations. I think this is a very important mechanism for naming and shaming about how you bring in accountability. I just thought I'll just place it here before I go to the practical examples. Now, some of the examples I wanted to draw from my own line of work, what I had seen, or my affiliation now with Tata Institute of Social Sciences, abbreviated called TIS, I wanted to bring. When I came to TIS, what actually surprised me is that, right at the inception of TIS, there is something called a project called Muskan. To our surprise, even today, it started way back in 1937. Even now in 2020, this project keeps running. This project is titled as the Child Guidance Clinic, otherwise called as Muskan. Very surprising that this was conceived in the mid-30s as a clinical service to child rights, emotional and behavioral issues or problems. It's a kind of a clinical-based approach to look at how there can be inclusive space to reach out to children to promote their mental health and well-being. Just I thought to share an example. A visual I have here. Next slide, please. To show that how this was practically experimented. I was just trying to pull out these from some of the TIS website archives. I just happened to see it. Next, about the TIS coming into the, moving into the new place. in the late 30s, early 40s. This again, the next slide, please. So it's about the Kurukshetra refugee camp. When I came in and looked at it, I have recently set up one center for statelessness and refugees. When I came in, this was an information that way back in 1949 that TIS could go and set up in the Kurukshetra, the borders of India and Pakistan, when the partition refugees were flowing on the both sides, and how it could do a professional social work in terms of doing a shelter management. Very interesting to see how practically they could go and address people, and particularly at the time, many people were even without any nationality or new identity as a citizen, but they were just made to flee here and there, and then it needs a certain way of providing them the basic shelter, basic food, and other essentials. I just looked at this and felt that it is something very interesting, that if they could do that in the late 40s and so why we are not able to. But interestingly, when I looked at the trajectory of this, many times I think it has gone into addressing many disasters and other national crises, whether it is Bhopal gas tragedy, whether it is the Indian Ocean tsunami, whether it is the Sikkim earthquake, Kashmir floods, the recent Uttarakhand floods, the Nepal earthquake. To several of them, it keeps responding. That's something very interesting in terms of, in a professional way, in terms of relief, rehabilitation, reconstruction. Next, please. This is the visual I have here about the first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, visiting TIS. It seems he was very impressed with what TIS did in Kurukshetra refugee camp, where he inquired what these people were doing, a professional, well-balanced, very, very professional approach in terms of rehabilitating people. He was told that it is a Tata Institute from Mumbai. So he said that he will make a visit when next time he comes to Mumbai. And keeping his words, he visited TIS in 1951 and dedicated one block also. He opened a block, and that visual I just. Next slide, please. This is a visual I have here about Eleanor Roosevelt, who had visited TIS. As we all know, that she's one of the important hands in, developing the UDHR, and she had a very pivotal role, highlighted again by Mr. Milun Kathari the other day. She made a visit, and then she tries to look at how TIS is able to fuse some of the theory and practices in terms of upholding the human rights. Now, I just would like to take up some examples in my own line of work, where, for example, we have a program called Masters in Law Access to Justice. We started in 2013. As the students were passing out, a question came that, well, the lawyers are tuned in the one-year program to become sensitive to human rights, sensitive to promote rights and justice of people. How this is going to be practiced? How are they going to do it? Therefore, we within TIS mobilize some resources with our former director, Professor Parshuraman, being an inspiration and facilitating some funds. We could actually start a process of fellowship. What is the idea of this fellowship? The Access to Justice Fellowship is one where, after passing out from the Masters in Law course, Access to Justice, they could take any theme and go to any part of India with a field mentor. They could actually start working on their own, looking at what are the issues on the ground and how they would like to address and facilitate the access to justice, what are the ways of overcoming the barriers to justice, and how that could be seen as one incubation or an illustration where that could replicate. And that's how we have given a choice to the outgoing 13 students. Nearly about 11 or so picked up these programs in the very first batch. The second batch we could give similarly around 8 to 10, and 3 batches or so we could test. Right from the first batch, like, we were happy the way the themes were chosen. I'm just giving you a quite quick glimpse of how this worked. For example, there was a student who said that I will go to my very state in Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, the time they unified Jammu and Kashmir. And she said that I'm going to look at the forced disappearance issues. We asked her how, as an individual, you're going to do. She said she was very much affiliated with the parents of the disappeared, and There's an NGO which she's licensing. She would like to work. She's stayed with them for about a year and a half too, and contributed a lot, providing the socio-legal inputs in terms of addressing the forced disappearance. Similarly, there was a lady from Kerala who said that she would like to go to Wayanad district in Kerala and look at the community forest engagement, where she said that the new forest laws, FRA and other things which came up were trying to affect the forest dwellers, and she wanted to mediate it. Very quickly, she was able to establish herself to become a resource person, where the forest department engaged her as a resource person to educate the forest department on one side and then engage the people on the other side, the forest dwellers, that what are their rights and do's and don'ts. And that became very popular. I mean, very quickly she could conduct a few trainings and capacity building, and very interesting engagement she did. Similarly, we had seen people going to Muzaffarnagar post Muzaffarnagar violence and took up some cases where they could identify new cases of rape and other things which were left out previously, and work with Advocate Vrinda Grover and go to courts and protect the rights of people. Similarly, custodial death issue, prison issues, scheduled caste, scheduled tribe atrocities issues, trafficking issues. For example, there was a student who had gone to Jharkhand and said that she would, look at the source of trafficking, and very quickly the Honorable High Court of Jharkhand appointed her as a focal person to mediate between the court and civil society, where she was able to provide the data, information, and the legal aspects, and something interesting she could contribute, and she's now continuing to do so. Somebody went to the most affected areas, the left-wing extremism, and tried to mediate between the state and the civilians who are affected with the crossfire. Some of the students, 5 or 6, went to northeast part of India, stationed at Guwahati, Assam, where it has another unit. And from there, they could take up the issues in the neighboring states of Manipur, Mizoram, and other things, how customary laws versus the other laws, national laws, land right issues, gender issues they could take up. Similarly, somebody within Maharashtra took up and set up a kind of a resource center for domestic violence, where the domestic violence practical guidelines, practical actions were mediated. Like that, we had very interesting themes, at least another dozen of them. I'm not saying everything to positive time, that we had attempted to bring in. This we could actually directly from our school set it, facilitate it, and see how students could go and practically uphold the human rights, practically be the facilitators between the duty bearers and the rights holders. And that's a very interesting process of recording the first time with very many mentors, even including Mr. Henry was here giving them orientation. Dr. Colin Gonzalez was here, Ms. Maya Darwal was also here. So they are all here to mentor our students, and therefore they did it. Then after, by 17 or so, we needed to pause, because again, fund becomes an issue. That 2-3 years we were able to manage it, then fund became an issue. Then we were kind of not able to continue the fellowship, and then we are thinking that we would revive this anytime soon. Just to give again glimpse of other things, I just want to share a few things within just how the practical action vis-a-vis human rights happen. The special cell for women and children introduced. This was done almost now about 25 years of experimentation. When Mr. Rogerio himself was a police chief, he seemed to have supported these kind of programs. And now it has gone very successful, where there can be a special cell for women and children. Many states are replicating these things, many states and union territories. Rogerio himself came here and told that it is one of the successful programs that, along with just that, he could see them coming into the light. Similarly, an example of Saksham called the HIV and AIDS counseling program, which is there. It had done in networking with the 40 other academic institutions. It has reached out to about 12,000 counselors in terms of national HIV/AIDS counseling program. The next example, I'm shifting the slides. Next example, please, on the rural distress and livelihoods. With the request of the Mumbai High Court, that this Tuljapur campus undertook a study of suicides in Maharashtra, which was a very important issue. The report was appreciated with the court for providing valuable insights in terms of rural livelihood crisis and policy recommendations. this could play this role. I'm just trying to take 2-3 minutes to rush and finish some slides. For example, there's a program called PRIAS, Field Action Project within TIS, which deals with criminal justice. It is done by the Social Work Department of Criminology and Justice, which tries to focus on service delivery, networking, training, research and documentation, policy change with respect to custodial rights and institutional rights and rehabilitation of people found vulnerable. The next example is a project called Koshish, which tries to address homelessness. A very young man named Mr. Tariq, a good friend of mine, the former student who took this issue very passionately, and he's able to bring this as a model where addressing homelessness. Initially, his idea was to start this program to address the repealing of the draconian beggary prevention law in Mumbai, and apparently found relevant in many places where there are destitutes, and how the poverty is criminalized, how issues of denotified communities, transgender, persons with mental illness, leprosy, and other chronic illness, they're all affected, and how homelessness as issue. I'm sure this project its relevance even now. They're actively working in the COVID. I'm sure this is very relevant for us to see when many are stranded, migrant workers, many are affected. These are all very relevant approach. Just I'm flagging this as a model. The next one is an interesting program called, I have one or two more. Next one is called the Project Chinnati. Interestingly, a colleague of mine from our School of Law, Rights and Constitutional Governance, Professor Asha Bajpai, herself a professor having expertise on child rights. She's having one important UN Child Rights Convention chair. She's able to hold and deliver. A few years back, when there was a news report that in the media that there are children in the homes, that mentally challenged children, adolescent girls were sexually abused, and they were affected when it was taken sumoto in the court. She appeared as an amicus curiae, and she could take up this program into a larger sense of how the mentally challenged children could be rehabilitated. Next slide, please. Where they could be rehabilitated through therapy, through counseling, and how in a due course that they could be put into some kind of a professional training, and they could be self-sufficient on their own. So this is a kind of an ongoing rehabilitation project, Chinnati. Right. There's one important thing here I would like to share is that for the first time, in the courts that as we know, a law of evidence, that the mentally challenged children or mentally challenged people are not their version or their things are not taken as evidence. Very interestingly, in this case, Professor Asha Bajpai could keep certain people as counselors who could actually use their sign language of the children, understand and translate. And that matter was taken as an evidence in the court, and the concerned people were actually apparently punished who belong to this so that's something very interesting, and we appreciate the rehabilitation part of it. It's not about just delivering justice means that somebody is found guilty that they are punished alone, but how they are in a due course rehabilitated. And there's a program called Tanda, which is about towards advocacy, networking, and development action, dealing with the denotified communities. One particular community called Pardi Community, they took it up in and around Maharashtra by the Center for Criminology and Justice, and they could, in a due course, go to the various facets of their development, including their education and other support they could actually provide them. The last I would like to just share is that something called Prime Minister's Rural Development Fellowship. When I came in just in 2012-13, at the time this was just rolling out, and I could be there part of this process in a second. In a nutshell, this is nothing but the Ministry of Rural Development and TIS conceptualized a thing that in the left-wing extremist areas, they would take the students who are trained as fellows, and they would go and be a bridge between the government policies, programs, and the grassroots realities. It is this that the government questioned initially, that how will students go there to the field and to work and identify issues of the people. This assured them that the training and orientation will be such that they will be very passionate about going and working, not just the marginally vulnerable, some of the most remotest areas of the central India where nobody had gone much to understand the issues. And interestingly, in 2 cycles between 11 and 15, that in 2 cycles around 150 students in 2 batches, almost to the tune of 280 students have gone and been in some of the remote tribal areas and could give insights on what are the developmental deficits. Thereby, just try to look at these left-wing extremism or Maoism as it is called, not from the security lens, but more from the development deficit lens of what people require. I think that's an interesting program. Again, there's a pause to this program in 15-16. We haven't heard yet again whether this next phase of the program is to be done, and we from TIS are awaiting that third cycle will happen. So these are some examples. I thought, the practical aspects of rights and how do we bring in the human rights based approach to the issues which we see on the ground. I think there I will stop here. Over to you, Matthew. Sorry that I've exceeded some time.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for all the inputs you have given and also an insight into TIS. A lot of work undertaken by TIS since 1937. So thank you for capturing it with regard to human rights based approaches. Just one question I will ask, and then you can respond to it quickly, and then Henry can conclude. A participant asked with regard to difference between convention and covenant. Difference between convention and covenant. That's all.
Yeah. No, I think covenant is basically the the product of the convention. Largely, we classify them as conventions, treaties. These are the kind of classifications on the nature of engagement, what kind of deliberation and what kind of product you have in terms of the nation states which can come and participate. So covenant is the product where you are using it from the convention, and then you are you are using it as a tool which has got more of an universal appeal. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Over to Henry.
Thank you so much. The participants have
Ability.
Thank you, Pari, once again for being with us. I'm so happy that in addition to the subjects that were to be handled, you were also able to take the participants through a variety of experiments that the Tata campus, an academic campus, has been able to engage in its long years of experience. Thank you so much. I'm sure there will be more occasions for you to come in this course itself. And for this person who asked the last question, we need to tell the person, don't be caught up with all these terminologies. These terminologies are there to confuse you and me. Covenants, conventions, treaties, for you and me in terms of using the international UN mechanism are the same. And that is enough for us to move in the field of human rights. Let's not get into the technicalities, because what you need is the mechanism to be able to use. Without wanting to cross time, which I think I will, I am appealing to all participants. I appeal personally. I appeal on behalf of all the team of facilitators, the IHRE core group and admin team. Kindly cooperate with your facilitators for the short 10-minute, 15-minute roundup feedback every evening that they will be convening. I know beyond that is not compulsory, but the 15 minutes is not compulsory, but I plead with you to cooperate. This is the only way we can get feedback from a large audience like you, and I request you kindly ensure that you are there in that meeting 15 minutes. Your facilitators are taking steps to convene that meeting, either by Jitsi or by Zoom or by Google Class or any other means. We have left it up to you all to decide. 10 to 15 minutes, your feedback is important. And if we don't listen to your feedback, we will not be listening to participants. Thank you very much for your cooperation. I'm sure you will give your facilitators fullest cooperation. They were saying, sir, please plead with them. I said, I will definitely plead with them. And therefore, I'm pleading on behalf of everybody. This is the return that you can give us so that we ensure that we keep up what we have promised you. Thank you. I've crossed 1 minute. I don't want to do that. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Parivelan. And tomorrow morning, 8:45, you will be there with us, and we will moving on to the thematic laws that deal with the thematic human rights that are going to follow, with Akila, a lawyer from Chennai, handling the session. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you, Bari. Thank you, Bari.
Thank you.